The Bliss Business Podcast, the show about empathy, connection, and consciousness in business. Today's episode is brought to you by Zero Company, your paid search, social media, and programmatic ad experts.
Welcome to the show. We've got myself, Steven Skash. We've got Tulio Siragusa and Ash Mar. Today, we're going to talk about the art of leading with heart, or rather, the importance of empathetic leadership. And on that note, let's go back into the time machine for a minute. I want to talk about Enron, the cautionary tale, of course. Here's their company vision: to be the leading company achieved by the relentless pursuit of shareholder value through free markets and innovation. The relentless pursuit of shareholder value, that was their guiding light, and it's not anything unusual. It's been popularized by Milton Friedman and many others that the company is responsible to its shareholders. That's its primary responsibility. So Enron wasn't thinking any different than anyone else. Enron's environment, though, fostered this belief in survival of the smartest. Success was achieved through advancement as a result of outcompeting others. And this guiding light led to a workplace culture that really prioritized short-term gains and individual success over ethical considerations and long-term stability. So one of the key elements of this is something that's called stack ranking, or as it was referred to in Enron, rank and yank. You evaluate your employees based on the top tier, one or two middle tiers, and then this bottom percentage. And every year, the bottom percentage at Enron was fired. So think about this. 30% of Fortune 500 companies use stack ranking. So the top 20% are rewarded, the bottom 10%, 10-15% or so are fired or warned. The middle 70%, well, you're told you're average. So you've got this system that demoralizes 80% of your workforce. Not to mention, this is going to cause, a lack of teamwork and maybe diversity of thought, and maybe result in some unpleasant folks just moving up the ladder because they're hitting, this bottom line KPIs. So how did we get here with things like rank and yank? I say it kind of goes back to that primary drive that Enron has, and most, a lot of companies have, is that single sole goal of the pursuit of shareholder value. Instead of valuing all your stakeholders, so that means, not just investors, but employees, customers, vendors, your community. So valuing just one part of the equation, the investors, is, going to lead you off the track a little bit. So what I want to talk about now is, who exactly are you leading when you're a leader? You've got all these different groups. So Tulio and Ash, who are we leading?
I think, first of all, you have to acknowledge that you're leading yourself to begin with. And what are you leading yourself toward? It really is about becoming a better human being every day, being someone that other people can count on. So it's really about accountability, self-accountability, integrity. At least for me, those are the main principles. Living with truth. And once you can embody that for yourself, then the natural extension is to help others step into that as well. So to me, leadership is really about enabling others to step into leadership. And the only way to do that is through example. You can teach leadership, write about it, but until you're actually embodying those principles and giving someone something to emulate that resonates with them, you're just kind of paying lip service to it. So it's about leading others to step into their own leadership, and through that process, creating a better work environment and actually a better world.
Yeah. So you've got all these people, you're leading the employees, and you've got to make sure you're taking care of yourself first, but you've also got, you're trying to teach leaders to lead within your organization as well. And all these people, they have lives, right? They've got families, they have different roles in the company. Might be, the older person transitioning to a new role. It might be, the working parent and stuff. You've got also vendors and people in the community. If you're a big company that's working in a community, you've also got to consider just, your impact on the community. Ash, what are your thoughts about Like, who are we leading here?
No, and I have to just piggyback. I want to take a moment to just that you're leading yourself. I want to focus on that a little bit, because when I look back at any leader that I've actually followed in my past, it wasn't anyone that actually told me what to do. It was someone that inspired me to take action, because I respected how they led themselves and led the organization after the fact. I think focusing on yourself. And I think, Steve, we've had this conversation previously. It's about you as the leader first. So going back into, people having issues in their lives and things that go on where you need empathy from your employees. Well, how can you expect empathy from your employees when you're going through a tough time if you're not expressing that same level of empathy towards them when they're going through a tough time? And as leaders, I think we have a hard time. Sometimes we feel like our employees are telling us lip service or telling us things where they want to get out of work, because we have these these notions, these preconceived notions of how people are, and that they're inherently lazy and so on and so forth. But the reality is, it's sort of a feedback loop. If you are leading yourself and you say, hey, you know what, I'm going to be the most empathetic leader, the most understanding leader I can be, well, then you could expect that to sprinkle down to the rest of your organization. So it all starts with you. That's really what it is. You can't say you're leading a team. You're leading you first and inspiring others to act after the fact.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, as a leader, work on yourself. And I don't just mean, go to the gym. I don't just mean pick up leadership books. Yeah, do that, but do the hard work on yourselves, do the shadow work, get in there, get messy, look at your fears, look at your relationships with your parents, your childhood, look at your trauma. Don't be chicken shit with this stuff, go in there, do the hard work. Your employees don't need to deal with your issues, right? It's the opposite. You need to be the one who's working with them, right? So I totally agree with that 100%.
Isn't it interesting too that you start to find, as you're working on yourself, that people become more relatable to you? Have you guys, am I the only one to think that? Like, have you noticed that as you're working on yourself and going through trials and tribulations, that others become relatable? And then you have moments where you're like, oh yeah, no, I've experienced that too. Let me give you my advice on the situation based on my actual experience. Because when you start working on yourself, you start to create more actual experiences that are relatable.
That's when empathy becomes alive. It really it's being a leader is a calling. It's a calling to serve others. And when you begin to see it that way, you shift your whole context. It's not about extracting value from others, which is how most of these companies run, these fiat-based companies run. How do I extract the maximum value from everybody? That's not what leadership is about. That's in some cases really tyranny, right? When you start thinking it's a calling to serve, then you begin to change your context of what value can I add to everyone who's relying on me to help them be successful. It's a completely different mindset and approach, and that requires stepping into becoming self-aware, growing out of those things that are holding you back, that are not going to allow you to serve those that you're willing to serve. It requires tremendous effort. It's not about, getting the pat in the back. It's about giving the pats in the back, and shifting into that direction, having that context shift that I'm here to serve is a key component to being an extraordinary leader, in my opinion. And I think a lot of people would agree with that thought process too.
For sure. Ash, so there are people, though, who might say, I'm not into that empathy thing. If we're trying to convince them with some data, or some KPIs on this, what kind of data do you have on empathetic leadership?
No, absolutely. And this is for those leaders who are like, okay, I like how this all sounds, but how does this make me money? How does this build a successful organization? Is this all just fluff? Well, no, this data actually backs this up. So a couple of things here. A survey by Ernst & Young Consulting revealed that 90% of U.S. workers believe empathetic leadership leads to higher job satisfaction, and 79% agree it decreases employee turnover. So this suggests that empathetic leadership is not just a desirable trait, but also a practical tool for enhancing employee retention and satisfaction in the workplace. Now, on loyalty and retention, the same Ernst & Young survey found that 88% of respondents feel empathetic leadership creates loyalty among employees towards their leaders. Moreover, over half of the survey participants had left their previous job due to lack of empathy from their bosses. either in their work struggles or personal lives. And I'm sure I'm already thinking about myself and some of the conversations I personally have had. And I'm sure we've had other individuals that we've had conversations with who left an organization where they were like, yeah, no, they didn't have the empathy, didn't care about me. I was just another cog in the wheel. I'm out, that kind of thing. Now, on the topic of work-life balance, diversity, and inclusion, according to Catalyst, empathetic senior leaders significantly contribute to employees feeling better, able to maintain work-life balance. 86% with empathetic leaders versus 60% with less empathetic bosses. Empathetic leadership is also crucial in supporting diversity and inclusion initiatives. For example, 62% of women of color with empathetic leaders felt their life circumstances were respected, leading to a lower likelihood of considering leaving their organization. Now, on the topics of where the business owners really care about, how does this benefit my business on top of the bottom line? Well, in terms of innovation and business success, a study from Nielsen discovered that empathy leads to a higher likelihood of innovation and success in business. For instance, successful launches of fast-moving consumer goods were often linked to cognitive empathy, enabling a better understanding of customers. And then regarding employee retention and business outcomes, Business Solver found that 83% of employees would consider leaving their current organization for a similar role at a more empathetic organization. Additionally, 84% of CEOs believe empathy is key to producing positive business outcomes. And the list goes on. There's more and more data to keep discussing this. And if you guys are interested in learning more after the show, all of this will be found in show notes at blisspodcast.com. All within the show notes there. And I definitely, if you guys have any questions regarding the comments on that, but there's so much data as the benefit of empathy and being an empathetic leader. It's groundbreaking. It's like you would think there'd be more studies and people would be talking about it in business school. Instead, we're still talking about bottom lines, not about how much more we could spread empathy in the world and see these kinds of, data points come into play with how people feel, employees feel, consumers feel, and so on.
Yeah, I like one of those last points you made was it was something like 83% or whatever would leave the company for a company that's more empathetic. So if you're worried about, doing nothing else, if you want to retain your employees, put a little effort here.
Yeah.
We've said before too in previous podcasts, there's data though on companies that consider this more holistic approach to running their business, right? Where they compared companies like this, and after 10 years, they had a 410% return for shareholders versus the S&P 500, which had 107%. 15 years, it was 1,681% compared to the S&P, which was 118%. So if you're worried about shareholders, you should be worried about some of these other areas, right?
No, absolutely. And overall, the data shows that the employees are performing better at their jobs, which then leads to the shareholders being happy. The reality is, like, when you make the employees happy and they're all, galvanizing together to do something positive because they believe in their leader, then it leads back into the shareholders getting the benefits because you're seeing innovation, you're seeing success, you're seeing collaboration, you're just essentially fostering this environment of success.
It's interesting. We've often heard this saying, people don't leave their company, they leave like a bad boss or toxic boss. But what I'm hearing from these stats is people actually leave organizations that lack empathy. Bottom line, if you feel misunderstood or not listened to or heard or validated, you're not going to last there very long. I mean, it's no different than being in a bad relationship, right? If you're in a relationship where you're not heard, validated, supported, that's not going to be a successful relationship. For some reason, we think, those principles don't apply at work, but they do. And we've also heard the saying, happy employees, happy customers. So if your employees are not happy, it's going to transcend to how well the customers are served. So it's fascinating to me that the data suggests that empathetic leadership is actually a better way to run a business. It's redefining how you're successful as a business. And yet it's not something that's discussed at the board level or planned or put into motion, supported by most CEOs. You might have a good chief people officer or head of HR that's consciously progressive that comes in and tries to implement some of these principles, but it's not often implemented. And I'm curious to find out why that is. Like, any research that suggests why there's such a resistance to this idea of adopting more empathy in the business when every data point suggests that it's good for the business.
I think there was a couple points made earlier that answered that question, Tulio, and I think Steve said it. People are too chicken shit to put in that work towards themselves. And I wanted to kind of expand upon that, but I didn't want to segue too far, but I think that is the answer, is that they don't want to do the work that involves working on themselves to be able to deal with issues that come onto
too much self-accountability there.
Too much self-accountability. That's what it is. So that could be it. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So for me, a huge part of leadership and my job satisfaction is being in the service of helping people self-actualize, right? And so if I'm not putting any work in on myself at all, doing that, then that's going to fall flat unless I've got someone who's like, hey, you're the self-actualized woman, take care of these people. That at least would help, but for me, that's really a major part of my job satisfaction. So when I'm doing something, I'm thinking in a couple different terms. I'm thinking of, like I've said before, that currency of revenue, right? The revenue currency, this objective world thing that's, it's what you've got to have to make your business run, right? But there's this whole other side of it where it's just the currency of love, right? So you've got revenue, objective world, it's an exterior thing. There's books written on that. Ayn Rand wrote about objectivism, capitalism, and all that. But there's this other half of the world that a lot of leaders just sort of ignore, and it's this interior, subjective world. And love is the currency in there, right? What else is the currency in there? And it's something bigger in the service of others, that you're kind of pursuing. And it's an endless resource available to you, right? You're never going to run out of it. It's not going to go, the well's not going to be tapped dry, right? It's something that's always available. I want to read a couple quotes. First one is by the former CEO of Unilever, and he said that leadership is not just about giving energy, it's unleashing other people's energy. Mm-hmm. And the other quote is from Ralph Nader. The function of leadership is to produce more leaders, not more followers. And so I think both of those, it really is kind of focused on this self-actualization, kind of approach. I want to make other leaders, because at times in your business, you're going to need to be a leader and you're going to need to be a follower, but you've got to be able to shift roles in there. So yeah, I don't know, like, to your point, Ash, is like, why aren't they looking at it, for this interior world? It's not an either or thing. It's an and both, right? You can pursue revenue, but you can also pursue asking yourself, what's the loving thing to do here in this situation? And you do that to not just my employees, but also my customers, my vendors, my community, the wider view you can take on that, the more empathetic you're going to be able to lead. So
I think you said something really interesting, Stephen, about being a good follower. And that might be sort of the crux of this. You become a better leader when you learn to be a better follower first. If your ego is too inflated, it's hard to follow. All you want to do is just have control. So I think a lot of it has to do with the need to be in control. It's this false sense of security that if you're the boss, you're in control, versus this idea that you're following a principle, and that principle is guiding you and ultimately making the organization better and making you a better leader. And I think it comes down to egos. People.
It's so true. I mean, higher consciousness is about losing your ego. The whole thing. Like, so we've seen all the maps and charts about higher consciousness, and really it's about losing your ego as you go along. And what's going to happen in the future of business is that as more of us gravitate toward this higher consciousness, business is slowly following it, right? So this is going to be the future of business. So you can ignore this if you want, but the consciousness is evolving. And the main part of that is really, it's a couple things. It's be humble and be loving. And, if you do those things, being humble, that's about losing your ego in the process. So yeah, I agree 100% on that.
And I think that the big challenge and what we're trying to overcome with this podcast is that we're trying to intertwine love with the concept of business, where the idea was that business was war, right? We have to imagine a century of where people used to actually used to go to war, and then we brought in economics, and that was our new way of gathering resources. We didn't have to blow each other up anymore. We had to think economically, but we still took an approach of battle, right? With if someone's taking market share, the Japanese believe it's like you're taking rice from your family, from your children's mouth, so they would go to war. Now it's like, okay, if this has been the understanding that business needs to be war, and people, and they still play, and now they've come to the realization that's not the case anymore. That ego attachment's still there. I think with this podcast, what we're trying to show everybody is I know there's a connection between love and business, and it doesn't have to have this background where everything has to be a fight. No, more love actually leads to the result, and the data is showing that to be true.
It's interesting. There's so many books that are business related, business strategy. You've got Machiavellian book. It's all about the art of war. It's
war.
like
48 laws of power. Yeah.
I'm gonna go take your lunch. I mean, it's so like I'm just gonna get you. And here we are saying, actually, what works really well, and the data shows, is that when you actually go and like spread love, that seems to resonate better with people and work better for your business too.
I think back in the 80s.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think back in the 80s, everyone, kind of clung to the Sun Tzu art of war, and just, sort of a kill or be killed kind of mentality. They just picked certain things they liked from it that was actually kind of this, from this warrior culture is where it is. There are some higher consciousness going on in Sun Tzu's art of war, but they just picked the lower warrior sort of, stuff out of there so that they could excuse kill or be killed.
They chose the shadow warrior. I mean, because even in the archetypes, right, you do have a warrior archetype, but the higher archetype is someone who serves and fights for the things that matter for his family or her family or the organization. So they're not fighting people, they're fighting for a principle. They're standing firm towards a certain principle, whereas the shadow version of that warrior is the tyrant, the controller, all those things that we just talked about. So it's interesting they took the shadow piece of it and applied those to business instead of the higher consciousness piece.
But and before we segue, I just want to, there's one point Tula you made that was so powerful, it's stuck into my mind. I just want to end. I don't know if this is the ending, but I definitely wanted to say this real quick. When it comes to a boss, I really have to think back to it. Do I actually know a bad boss? I mean, sure, I've called bosses bad in my mind, but what have been the bosses that I refer to as the bad bosses? They're the ones that were the least empathetic towards me or any of my situations, or the ones that made me uncomfortable in a workspace. I can't actually go back and look back and say, oh, my boss was a bad boss because he was bad at inputting the numbers correctly of our SKU items, right? No, the bosses all knew how to do their jobs and do their jobs well. But when I ever thought of a bad boss, it was the one that showed the least empathy. So for the audience, if you could look back, and think about your bad bosses, I think about 80% of the bad bosses were ones that show, you could probably think back to that and think, oh, that's possibly someone that just didn't show empathy towards me, versus the 20% of those actually being bad at their jobs. Something to think about. So I just wanted to throw that out there because that really did resonate with me, and I hope it resonates with the audience as well.
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Tula.
I wanted to add, it's a two-way street as well, right? Yeah. Empathy is also not being so judgy about everything that the boss is doing. It goes both ways. So if you're constantly looking and analyzing and making a list, and that's not empathy on your part towards that individual as well. So it works both ways. It's also knowing that person's not perfect. They're going to mess up. Then doesn't mean they intended to. They're not naturally nefarious, but they're going to make mistakes. And so you can make that list and get all resentful about it, like we talked about it in the last show, or you can go and address it, and show some empathy. So it works both ways. And it's reflective in organizations today. There's not enough energy put towards it, right? Not just from a leadership perspective, but even within the employee base, right? Having empathy for each other, having empathy for clients, having empathy for the challenges of meeting the shareholders' value, et cetera, right? So it's a bilateral relationship that needs to be fostered. And
Yeah, and
we're failing at
I totally agree with that too, Leah. I think that goes to the heart of the problem. It's that purpose is the business purpose to maximize the profit of the shareholders specifically. And if you're funneling everything through that, then that means that you want the best people for the lowest possible wages. It means you want to plunder the natural resources at the cheapest cost, right? It means getting the most out of your customers' wallets for the least effort and the least expense, right? So if you're focusing on just that one element of shareholder profit, you're losing the ability to make this a win-win for all the stakeholders, right, in there. So to that point, I was thinking about this, and I asked AI, what is the sole purpose of a parasite? And it said to me, it said, this is ChatGPT. It said, the sole purpose of a parasite is to exploit its hosts for resources necessary for its own survival and reproduction. Wow. That kind of sounds like the problem here. Maybe I'm just, drawing.
Most businesses are parasites.
Oh, well, wow.
If you heavily weigh one of these stakeholders way too much and not these other ones, it's going to be this sort of parasitic relationship, right? Ideally, you want to be able to pay your employees the best you can in your industry, right? Doesn't mean you have to pay them crazy amounts, but you'd like to be able to pay them the best you can. And you'd like to be able to make sure, you're getting vendors that are sourcing the materials, ethically and things like that. So when you start moving beyond just this maximizing profits and you move into sort of the bliss mentality that we talk, build love into scalable systems. When you're building love into everything you're doing, you're going to start asking these questions like, what's the loving thing we can do here with this particular relationship? How can we make this a win-win? And I get it when you're a small business owner, and you're trying to maximize your growth and stuff. Sometimes, yeah, everyone's got to, take a little hit on that, and it's tough. Yeah. But when you're, focused on, hey, we've got record revenue numbers this year, but I've still got my annual rank and yank 10% that I need to fire despite having these record year. I mean, what are you doing? Right. So if you want to start thinking about bigger picture, you got to get out of that narrow focus, which I think was back to your point, Ash, is on that. It's just being so narrowly focused on that. That's really kind of the root of the problem a lot of times. So besides moving beyond this bigger focus of all these stakeholders, what are some other tips for empathetic leadership that you guys might have? That
I found 4 there's a lot, but 4 that really resonated with me. One in particular out of the 4, the 4 are compassion and understanding, really taking a genuine interest in the feelings of others, not just what they're saying, but what they're feeling, and being inclusive, creating an atmosphere of inclusivity. Then also the power of active listening and engagement, prioritizing listening and really hearing what's being said, and even what's not being said. And then servant leadership and the focus on others. This is actually my favorite. It says the concept of servant leadership, where the primary goal is to serve rather than to command, highlights the importance of putting the needs of others first. Leaders who embody this principle often inspire loyalty and high performance as their teams feel valued and understood. This approach encourages a culture of mutual respect and cooperation, where the success of one is seen as the success of all. And this is such a big one, this idea of when one succeeds, we all succeed. We all rise when one rises. And that's a concept that a lot of companies struggle with because they create internal competition, especially in sales. And then finally, integrity and authenticity in decision-making, let your yes be yes, your no be no, and being committed to ethical leadership, which includes transparency and accountability. These 4 principles just resonate really well with me. It's like, if you got these, you can't fail if you embody these 4 principles as a leader. You really can't.
I think for me, Steve, there's a quote by a gentleman back in the day. His name was Stephen Covey. He wrote the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And in that book, he mentioned that the best leaders, or the recommendation he made for leaders, was he said, seek to understand than to be understood. So I think as a tip to leaders is really pulling yourself out of the idea that everything is going to be perfect. And you have to really seek to understand than to be understood. Because really your role as a leader is that you're really just playing the glue that's keeping everything together. I think at some point you pull yourself out of the expert role and you start to work with experts, and you're no longer sharpening those skills. Really, the skills you're sharpening is that of people and understanding their needs. So on top of understanding their needs, having that compassion, and also having that authentic, genuine, deep connection in terms of listening to somebody when they're speaking. And I think people could tell when you're deeply listening to them versus you're just staring at them, right? So having those 3 factors would be my suggested tips, being that these are things that I also am working on. But when you're really trying to build yourself and making it all about you and things to work on, just having the moment to sit down and work on that awareness ability, that listening ability, that care ability, the compassion, and all that comes from trying to seek to understand and seeking to understand everyone's issue than to try to have people understand your issues.
Yeah, I think, so where it gets real tricky is, for sure, as a leader, if you're in a big organization, you're not going to be able to communicate to everyone, right? So you definitely need to be able to communicate with your leaders and have them kind of have the same message, of empathy throughout the business. But you're also, because you've got a lot of things going, you're really KPI focused, I think, a lot of times. And so the KPIs that we're focusing on are often just revenue based, but they don't have to be, right? You've got these other sides of the business that you can work on. I think there's UPS and other companies have started using this triple bottom line approach, which is, it's starting to expand upon the regular bottom line. So you've got that, the economic portion of that we're all familiar with, all the KPIs in there, right? But then you've also got something that might be like a social portion or an environmental portion, these other 2 areas. So the social might be, what's your retention rate, right? Just asking that question, figuring that out. Oh, why is it so low? Let's dive into that. What are the leading indicators for us having this poor retention rate? And you might end up finding some other data you can pull in there that, shows, hey, we really kind of suck at this empathy thing here, or wow, we've got a lot of people resent the way we approach this one issue. But so like for UPS, it would be looking at the retention rate, it'd be looking at accident frequency, it would be looking at total charity. These might be the social KPIs they've come up with just to help keep the focus on the social side. And then on the environmental side, it might be something like total emissions, noise reduction, fuel efficiency, those kind of numbers where kind of as a leader, you can start to see you've got other things that you can focus on besides just that sole individual revenue number. So they have like this triple, bottom line approach, which I think is a start, but it doesn't, to me, kind of fully take in all the stakeholders like you really want. So I'm really interested in other companies and what kind of KPIs they're using to kind of manage this situation where, I'm a leader, I've got a lot of people, I need just data sometimes on these things, and that can be very, very tricky when you grow as a company and you start losing your culture, right? So I think having that, and for the Enrons out there, I wish there was a KPI that could show you the trauma you caused by firing, your 10% every year, even though your company may have record profits, things like that. Where are these trauma KPIs that some of these companies need out there? Any thoughts on the KPIs off the top of your head?
I think there's also a lack of awareness of the downstream effects of these things on both sides, right? So in the case of Enron, that left such a bad taste on so many people generationally, if they're not in business anymore, but if they were, they probably wouldn't be doing very well because generationally it's spread out like a wildfire. And conversely, those organizations that do well and treat people well, their family know about it and their families know about it, and it trickles down to everybody else. So there's a downstream effect from these things that are either positive or negative. And companies that aren't aware of that are doing themselves an injustice in running their business, not being aware of that.
Yeah, I think to piggyback off that, I mean, when you talk about KPIs, I don't think the question is asked enough. How fulfilled do you feel at your job? Do you feel secure at your job? Are there things that can make the experience a little bit better for you? Job status. But these aren't questions that get typically asked, but you have to imagine that they would have to put out that survey, right? Ask those right questions and then drive a correlation when all those needs are met, or at least look into companies that have those needs met for people where they feel secure at their job. They don't feel like they're being judged based on the numbers, or in case of the production of based on that value, right? They don't feel like they're being judged based on that, or they could lose their job if they're having a bad month, or if they're going through a tough time and they're not able to produce nearly as much. When there's a northern light that everyone follows, where they feel like they have that job security, you can imagine the type of innovation, the type of the ideas that an employee could come up with. So I think all in all, it's like they don't have those conversations. But if I were to look into KPIs, it's having that percentage of what percentage of my employees are actually satisfied with their jobs, and then what percentage feels secure. And then looking at those numbers, the ones that actually do feel secure, how are they performing? Oh, they're performing better. Wow, interesting. Those are the kinds of thoughts I'd have on that idea of KPIs.
Yeah, and I guarantee if you're doing that kind of surveys, if you're not taking an empathetic approach, your numbers aren't going to come back great. It might be a little shocking. The other point is, if you're not also really digging into what your bigger purpose is, your higher purpose as a business, right? Where everyone can kind of row in the same direction behind this job that gives them meaning. If you're not digging into that either, those numbers are going to be pretty poor. So let's recap real quick. So we've got a big issue, I think, is just the narrow focus of shareholder value versus a broader stakeholder value. I think that causes a lot of the issues. And then as a leader, how can I start broadening my view? Well, let's start coming up with more creative KPIs. Don't just look at the revenue KPIs. Look at some of these interior job satisfaction KPIs, things you're doing that are making the world better, and keeping those front and center as well. Look at like a start of a triple bottom line is a good place to start. Being a servant to your employees, like I'm here to help you. For me, it's like I'm here to help you guys self-actualize. How can I make you better leaders? I think that was a big one. Any other thoughts before we wrap up?
And I think finally, just recognizing the importance of being present. I struggle with that. The active listening, that's something I constantly work on, but just learning to be present and feeling what people are experiencing and having that inform you on what you do as well, not just looking at the data points.
And maybe start taking notes about certain interactions that you had with employees or with individuals, maybe where you didn't show that empathy, and then take note of what were the results of that relationship or that specific situation. And then maybe if you could recall in times where you did show empathy and what were the results of that. Start taking these notes and start looking back, and you can start actually pinpointing data percentages to your own life and areas that you could improve on.
Yeah, if you're doing that work too on yourself, right, that's just so huge. You're going to be able to feel like, oh, why did I contract in this situation? Why did, I feel like maybe lashing out or something, or why did I speak the way I wanted to speak? If you're doing the work on yourself, you're going to start identifying that more and more. And so that's just a huge part of it. So on the next Bliss Business Podcast, we're going to talk about positive empathy. What is it? So empathy doesn't always have to focus on your pain points, right? You can have happiness for others. You can celebrate that happiness. And when you do that, you'll find, I think that's one of the most powerful gratitude practices you can do. So the bigger goal here is how to develop a more authentic business. So you don't just talk the talk, but you walk the walk. So tune in and find out more in the next Bliss Business Podcast.